Turkish Islamic scholar Fethullah Gulen has died at the age of 83, with hundreds of Australian mourners gathering in Sydney over the weekend to mark his passing. Gülen had lived in the United States since 1999, despite attempts from Turkey's president Recep Tayyip Erdogan trying to extradite and prosecute the cleric for masterminding a failed coup in 2016. Since Gülen's passing, Turkish authorities have issued a statement that his followers should surrender without delay, according to independent media. So how does a social movement that seeks to meld secular science with religious values get designated as a terrorist organisation by Turkey? And what does this mean for the future of the movement? To answer that, I'm joined by Dr. David Tittensor, a senior lecturer in Islamic studies with the University of Melbourne and the author of The House of Service, The Gülen Movement and Islam's Third Way. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, President Erdogan blamed Gülen and his followers for plotting the failed 2016 coup that saw hundreds killed and thousands injured. Does Gülen's passing offer the closure Turkey needs to move on from this?
Not according to recent statements by both Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, or Erdogan himself. Fidan, immediately after news was received of Gülen's passing, said that they are not going to be complacent and that they will continue to pursue the movement globally. And more recently, I read that Erdogan has used even harsher terms, saying that they will look to eliminate the movement completely. So it doesn't look like his passing has actually changed the state of play in relation to the Justice and Development Party and the Gülen movement.
Why do you think the authorities are continuing this crackdown?
I think it's because they still see the Gülen movement as a challenger. They certainly were seen as that in Turkey or Turkey itself, because they were quite an extraordinarily large, well-heeled movement. They had hundreds of schools all across Turkey. They had over decades raised up, cohort upon cohort of people that were working in the bureaucracy, private industry and so forth. So they had an enormous following, and they were alleged to have also started a corruption probe against Erdogan and his government, which also threatened his son, Bilal, in late 2013. And this was really seen as the beginning of the sort of a tit-for-tat that took place between the movement, where Erdogan really took his gloves off, started to dismantle them from early 2014. So the positioning of the movement as a terrorist organisation in early 2016 and then blaming them entirely for the coup attempt is a very convenient narrative put forward by the government to allow them to continue that dismantling. And indeed, after the coup, 2016, they had confiscated somewhere in the vicinity of $11 billion worth of assets from the movement.
Now that Gülen has passed, what does this mean for the movement? Who will lead it?
I mean, if history is any guide, there's the possibility of, splintering and factions. There's always that risk that there's going to be perhaps disagreements. However, that said, there have been statements been put out by various organisations within the wider Gülen movement field, and they've said that there's going to be a consensus approach to a governing of the movement, and that it's going to be 3 or 4 of what they call Abis or big brothers, who are very close students of Gülen's, who are going to sort of take the movement forward.
Can you supply a bit more of a background of what the Gülen movement is and what its aims are?
Well, the Gülen movement was inspired by scholar Said Nursi, who was the originator of the idea of you didn't have to choose between being religious and modern. And he sort of was dealing with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and with the question of modernity. And so his writings became very, very popular, and Gülen became a follower of Said Nursi in the late 1950s. And then after the passing of Said Nursi in 1960, Gülen actually sought to actualize Nursi's teachings and set up summer camps where he would teach them in the religious sciences, which using Said Nursi's work and obviously his own interpretations and understandings in his own writings, but also would teach them the secular sciences with a focus on biology, chemistry and so forth. And then that during the 80s, when there was an opening up following the coup and the election of the Turgut Özal government, the Motherland Party, which had a religious inclination, they then were able to build schools openly across the country and became a leading education provider in Turkey or Turkey. And a key element of that is that Gülen said that you don't need to build more mosques, you need to build schools, and that being a pious person doesn't mean you can't be an accountant, doesn't mean you can't be a teacher or a journalist or a doctor. So he really just wanted people with an Islamic frame of reference to be out in the world, and that would then filter through society.
And as I mentioned, Gülen moved to the United States in 1999 and passed away there. What role did the United States play in supporting his movement?
Well, the United States, as I guess a liberal Western democracy, has been very supportive. There was a large groundswell of support, particularly from a number of prominent people, academics, and even people from the security in terms of government security agencies that were supportive of Gülen and wrote a letter to help him get his green card. So there's always been backing and support. I believe he was brought in as an exceptional individual to get his green card. And there's always been the similar levels of support in most other Western liberal democracies. And I think this is where part of the divide comes in terms of the thinking. So as I stated earlier, the idea that the Gülen movement was the only movement behind the coup is a convenient narrative for the government because it paints it as an enemy of the state. Whereas America asked Turkey to furnish the evidence for the request of extradition for Gülen and failed to actually do so to a standard that was required. So there hasn't really been the view that the Gülen movement is a terrorist organisation as the Turkish government claims. And this attitude is reflected in Australia and most other Western democratic states in Europe as well, is where they've actually provided asylum for people fleeing from persecution in Turkey and have continued to support the movement and their activities. Indeed, there has been reports of pressure put on government members and politicians not to attend their activities. The statement from some of those has been very clear, saying that we've never had a problem with the movement and we're going to continue our relationship with the movement. So in other words, they've sort of rebuffed that pressure that's come from the Turkish government.
Do you think followers of the movement should take the threat from Turkish authorities seriously, that they are looking for them?
Absolutely. There has been, according to reports, no less than 126 extraordinary renditions by recent counts of people from a variety of different countries. So they are absolutely aggressively pursuing them. I think they made, shortly after the coup attempt, there was more than 1,200 extradition requests to I think around 112 countries. So they are very aggressively pursuing the Gülen movement, and they also are not above very sort of underhanded tactics, such as using proxies to try and get to people, such as arresting their family. I think this is what happened to Enes Kanter, who's the famous basketball player in the US. I think they arrested his father. They're not against using those sorts of means to put pressure. So absolutely, I think members of the movement should be taking this seriously, because these are the kinds of tactics that are going to be used against them. And so there's a very risk, if they do have family back home, that they could be utilised as a means of trying to get to them.
Is Erdogan's hope that he can wipe out the movement? And I suppose, how likely is that wish?
There's probably a bit of rhetorical play there, where he's playing to his base. In this respect, to some extent, the movement is being sort of used as a bit of a bogeyman, if you like, to sort of prop up support for the government in Turkey, because there is, I think, across the spectrum, there is support from the secular camp dislike the movement, and of course his base dislike the movement, so it cuts across. So in that way, it plays a role domestically. I think probably in terms of the number of followers of the Gülen movement and the sheer breadth, at their peak they were at 160 different countries. They have no less than 150 charter schools in the US and around 13 schools here. So it's probably not realistic, particularly also given that there is a stark divide between how Western liberal democratic states view the movement versus the government. So they don't agree with the government's characterization, and they are providing support for the movement in many countries. So I think it's probably not realistic, but as I said, playing more to his base at home.
Dr. David Tittensor, Senior Lecturer in Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne.
Find more great ABC RN stories that take you beyond the headlines on the ABC Listen app.